My sister Melissa cleared her throat into the microphone, and the ambient jazz playlist at the barn at Sycamore Farms abruptly cut out. I was in the middle of smoothing down the front of my ivory silk dress when her voice bounced off the hand-hewn oak rafters. "Daniel," she said, looking directly at my fiancé while 40 of our closest friends and family sat with steak knives suspended midair, "your future wife has been sleeping with a 74-year-old man in Franklin for the last 3 years, and he's been paying her bills." My mother, Elaine, stood up beside her, nodding with a synchronized, grim tightening of her lips as she tossed a heavy stack of glossy 8x10 photographs onto the center linen table. The room went so quiet that I could hear the rhythmic, wet hiss of the beeswax candles melting down into the brass holders. Melissa thought she had just dismantled my life, but what she didn't know was that by doing this in public, she had just signed the legal paperwork that would evict her from our family estate by the end of next week. Before I tell you how those photographs ended up in her hands, I want to ask, where are you listening to this story from today? And what is the temperature outside your window? Drop it in the comments below, because I'm reading through them while sitting in the quiet home they tried to take from me. The air in the restaurant felt instantly thick, like the air in a greenhouse right before a thunderstorm hits. Mrs. Brooks, Daniel's mother, let out a sharp, audible intake of breath that caused her pearl necklace to click against her glass, on top of the white tablecloth. The top photograph showed me sitting on a green park bench near the historic square, my hand resting over the wrinkled hand of a silver-haired man. In another shot, he was sliding a thick, bulging yellow manila envelope across the wood table at the back of the Franklin Public Library. The camera angle was low, taken from behind the fiction aisles, capturing the exact moment my fingers curled around the paper packet. To anyone in that room, it looked like the textbook anatomy of a secret arrangement. I could feel 40 pairs of eyes shifting from the photographs to the front of my dress, waiting for the tears, the frantic denials, or the standard scene where the bride runs out to the parking lot. My pulse was drumming hard against my ribs, making my ears hum, but my fingers remained loose. I slowly lowered my silver salad fork, letting it rest against the rim of the porcelain plate with a tiny, metallic clink. I looked across the table, past the scattered glossies, straight into my sister's face. "Melissa," I said, my voice flat and dry, stripped of any inflection she could use to feed the drama. "How many months of your life did you waste putting this little performance together?" Beside me, Daniel didn't flinch, didn't check the photos, and didn't slide his chair away. Instead, his right hand reached beneath the heavy linen table, found my cold fingers, and squeezed them with a steady, calculated pressure that told me the trap was officially sprung. The drive back to my office that night was long, the hum of my truck's tires against the asphalt of Highway 96 the only sound cutting through the dark. I unlocked the glass door of Whitaker Landscape Design, the small commercial space I rented on the outskirts of Franklin, and let it click shut behind me. The air inside always smelled the same: rich, damp potting soil, rolled blueprint paper, and the faint, sharp tang of the fertilizer samples stacked in the back room. 2 oversized Boston ferns sat in the corners, their fronds casting long, ribbed shadows across my drafting table under the moonlight. I didn't turn on the overhead fluorescent lights. I just sat down in my old leather desk chair and looked at the blueprint of the Harpeth Hills Resort project laid out under a metal paperweight. It was a $500,000 contract, the biggest commercial bid I had ever won in Williamson County, a place where wealthy homeowners paid premium rates for the illusion of untouched, perfect nature. 9 years ago, when my father Richard passed away, I bought my first commercial lawnmower with a small personal loan and a used trailer that had a rusted tailgate. I chose this work because soil and stone don't know how to lie. They don't dress up malice in sweet, Southern hospitality, and they don't rewrite the truth over a family dinner table. If you neglect a plant, it dies. If you nurture it, it grows. It was a clean, predictable logic that my mother's house entirely lacked. After the funeral, Elaine had immediately remodeled the family living room, painting over my father's favorite wood paneling with an aggressive, clinical shade of white. She had spent those first 6 months trying to audit every conversation he had had before his heart failed, looking for account numbers that didn't exist. I moved out within 48 hours of the wallpaper being stripped. I built this business dollar by dollar, so I would never have to ask her for permission to breathe. My fingers traced the edge of the Harpeth Hills blueprint. Feeling the thick, textured paper, the grading work was scheduled to begin in exactly 3 days, and I had already ordered $20,000 worth of structural stone from the quarry. But 12 hours before Melissa stood up with that microphone, my business debit card had been declined at the local supply yard for a simple bulk order of mulch. I had logged into our commercial portal right there from my phone in the truck, the screen lighting up my face in the gravel parking lot. A bright red banner across the top read, "Account temporarily restricted." I called our local branch manager, a man named Henderson who had handled my father's commercial accounts for 2 decades. His voice on the line was quiet, professional, and heavily weighed down by awkwardness. "Naomi, we received a formal petition for a third-party forensic audit on the business foundational capital," he told me, the sound of his pen tapping against his desk coming through the speaker. "Until the verifying documents are submitted and reviewed, the bank is legally required to freeze all outbound transactional assets for a standard 30-day discovery window." An anonymous third-party claim had filed a legal motion stating my initial business startup funds were tied to disputed family estate assets. I sat in the dark of my office, remembering the exact cadence of Henderson's voice. He hadn't wanted to tell me who signed the affidavit, but the legal facts sitting on my desk right now carried the stamp of a small notary office downtown. The petitioner wasn't an anonymous corporate rival, it was Elaine Whitaker. My mother had used her remaining status as the executor of my father's basic personal will to file a claim of commingled funds. Her goal wasn't a legitimate audit. She knew my books were spotless because I balanced them myself every Friday night. She had timed the freeze precisely to disrupt the resort project, aiming to create a financial bottleneck that would force me to sell my 30% share of our father's residual hardware store stock back to Melissa for pennies on the dollar. They wanted me broke, desperate, and compliant before the wedding invitations even had their postage stamps affixed. I reached out and turned on my desk lamp, the yellow light illuminating the yellow manila envelope Harold had given me 3 days ago at the library. My family thought they were closing a net around a defenseless girl. They didn't know I had been building a concrete wall in the dark. The grandfather clock in the foyer of the Whitaker estate ticked with a heavy, rhythmic thud that always made the high ceilings feel narrower than they actually were. My mother's house sat on a pristine, tree-lined street in historic downtown Franklin, a 2-story colonial wrapped in white wooden siding that required painting every 3 years just to keep up appearances. It was Tuesday afternoon, 48 hours before the bank account freeze took effect, and the driveway was lined with polished SUVs. Elaine was hosting her monthly charity tea circle for the prominent women of the local preservation society. The scent of lavender water and expensive bergamot tea hung thick in the formal living room, nearly hiding the faint, sour smell of old floorboards beneath the oriental rugs. I had stopped by to drop off a spare set of keys to my father's old storage shed, a task I intentionally kept brief. My sister Melissa was leaning against the marble fireplace mantel, holding a porcelain teacup with her pinky finger extended in that studied way she used for her social media photos. At 36, she still occupied the east wing of the house, her lifestyle funded entirely by the residual monthly dividend checks from our father's former hardware business. She was wearing a designer silk blouse that I knew for a fact had been charged to our mother's shared department store credit card. "Naomi just walked in from one of her job sites," Melissa announced to the room, her voice carrying that specific, sweet-toned venom that passed for manners in our family. "Look at those boots. Mother, I honestly don't know how she handles all that mud and manual labor every single day." The women in the room offered polite, thin smiles, their eyes dropping to the faint trace of red clay on the edge of my canvas work shoes. Elaine adjusted her silver tea service, her expression hardening as she looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses. "Your sister chose a very non-traditional path. Ladies," our mother said, her tone dripping with a practiced, maternal disappointment. "We tried to encourage her toward a boutique or a gallery, but she prefers being out in the elements with the contractors. And marrying Daniel Brooks fits right into that aesthetic, doesn't it?" Melissa added, letting out a small, airy laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "An architect who specializes in mid-tier residential renovations isn't exactly building a legacy, but I suppose someone has to draw the blue-collar blueprints." I stood by the entryway, my hand resting against the doorframe, letting their words wash past me without offering a single line of defense. I had learned years ago that arguing with a parasite only invites it to dig its teeth in deeper. I stepped toward the kitchen counter to leave the keys, setting my locked work phone down next to the fruit bowl for less than 30 seconds while I reached into my jacket pocket. A sharp, clear vibration rattled against the granite countertop. Melissa's eyes immediately darted to the screen, which had lit up with a brief notification banner from an unsaved 10-digit number. The text message was stark, devoid of any personal greeting. "Franklin Library, 2 p.m. Bring the third quarter reports." Before I could pick up the device, the screen timed out and went black again. But the lines had already been etched into her memory. She didn't mention the text, nor did she ask who the message was from. Instead, she simply turned back to the guests, her smile widening into something predatory and sharp. The moment I left the house, Melissa picked up her own phone and dialed a number for a low-end to private investigation firm operating out of a strip mall near Murfreesboro. She authorized a 3-day retainer using the cash she had quietly taken from the household expense envelope on Elaine's desk that morning. She didn't want to warn me, and she didn't want our mother to intervene yet. She genuinely believed she had just stumbled upon a cheap, dirty secret that would give her total leverage over my business and my life. The tall wooden door of the Franklin Public Library creaked softly as I pushed it open, stepping into a stillness that felt entirely separate from the humid Tennessee afternoon. Inside, the air was cool and static, heavy with the unmistakable scent of decomposing paper, old leather bindings, and floor wax that had been layered over the oak planks for decades. Rows of massive oak bookshelves stretched toward the high ceiling, casting long, rectangular shadows across the worn green carpet of the history section. I walked toward the very back, near the tall arched windows that overlooked the side alleyway where the old brick mortar was crumbling. Harold Bennett was already sitting at a corner table beneath a brass reading lamp, his thick silver hair illuminated by the dull yellow bulb. He was 74 years old, but his posture was still as precise as it had been when he walked into my father's hardware store 40 years ago. A worn leather briefcase sat open on the chair beside him, its brass latches tarnished to a dark brown. Without a word of greeting, he slid a thick, heavy stack of legal documents across the dark wood table toward me, the paper bound tightly with a heavy steel clip. "These are the latest deeds for the Timms Ford Lake House properties and the commercial land parcels in Williamson County," Harold murmured, his voice barely louder than a rasping whisper that died in the empty aisle. "Your father spent the last 5 years of his life making sure these boundaries were bulletproof. Naomi." I pulled the chair out quietly, the wood legs making no sound on the carpet, and rested my forearms on the edge of the table. "My mother just petitioned the bank for a forensic audit on my landscaping firm's commercial capital," I told him, my voice flat. Harold looked at me through his thick bifocals, his expression unreadable, though a faint tightening occurred around his jawline. "She's fishing," he replied, leaning forward so our heads were only inches apart across the paperwork. Richard knew she would try to dismantle anything she couldn't see on a balance sheet. And that's exactly why we built the wall the way we did. He tapped his index finger against the top page of the packet, where rows of corporate asset numbers were printed in small, tight type. Your father wanted you to truly understand how these numbers move before you ever hold the keys to them, he said, his hand remaining steady over the document. The money is just ink on a ledger. The comprehension is your actual leverage. Patience is the final test he set for you. Naomi. Suddenly, Harold stopped speaking and let out a dry, hacking cough that shook his thin frame, his hand moving to his chest as he reached for a handkerchief in his pocket. Seeing him strain, a sudden spike of anxiety tightened my throat, and I reached across the table, wrapping my hand firmly around his frail, wrinkled wrist to steady him for several seconds. In that exact pocket of absolute silence, a sharp, metallic click echoed from the dark corner of the fiction aisle 15 feet behind us. It was the distinct, wet sound of a mechanical camera shutter dropping and resetting, a sound that didn't belong among the quiet turning of library pages. Any normal woman would have pulled her hand back, spun around in her chair, or demanded to know who was hiding behind the biography shelves. But my eyes had already caught the faint, gray reflection in the tall glass pane of the arched window directly to my left. Through the dusty glass, I had spent the last 10 minutes watching the blurred silhouette of a man in a wrinkled baseball cap pretending to look at Tennessee history journals while tilting a long camera lens through the gaps in the woodwork. I knew instantly that Melissa's cheap retainer money was hard at work in the shadows of the library. Instead of pulling away from Harold, I deliberately leaned even closer across the table, my hand remaining firmly placed over his as I pulled the yellow manila envelope toward the center of the light. I smoothed the paper out with my palm, ensuring the movement was slow, deliberate, and perfectly framed for the lens hiding in the dark. If my sister wanted a scandalous narrative to feed her desperation, I was going to give her the exact imagery she needed to hang herself with. The heavy velvet drapes in Elaine's formal living room were drawn tight against the afternoon sun, casting a dim amber glow over the plush upholstery and the mahogany coffee table. Melissa sat on the edge of the sofa, her fingers rapidly sorting through 20 glossy 8x10 prints that the private investigator had dropped off in a plain brown envelope an hour earlier. The sharp smell of stale coffee and Melissa's heavy floral perfume filled the confined space. "Look at this one, Mother," Melissa whispered, her thumb pressing down hard on the image of my hand wrapped tightly around Harold's wrist at the back of the library. "She isn't just taking his money for the business. She's touching him in public like they own each other." Elaine leaned forward, her silver reading glasses sliding down her nose as her face hardened into a mask of pure, venomous disgust. The gold bracelets on her wrist clinked loudly against each other as she snatched the photograph from Melissa's hand. 9 years I've watched her pretend she built that landscaping company out of sheer hard work and dirt, Elaine hissed, her knuckles turning white against the paper. I knew she didn't have the capital to secure that new resort contract on her own. She's dragging the Whitaker name through the gutter for a monthly allowance from a man old enough to be her grandfather. Melissa leaned closer, a small, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she adjusted her silk collar. "If Daniel sees these, the wedding is over by Friday morning," Melissa said, her tone dripping with calculated malice. "But if we play this right, we don't just stop the wedding. Once Daniel walks away and her reputation in Franklin is ruined, the board at the hardware firm will have no choice but to vote her out of her residual shares for moral turpitude. We can force her to sign over the title to her equipment just to pay off the audit debt we started." Elaine nodded slowly, her fingers smoothing down the edges of the photograph, as if she were already counting the cash from my bank accounts. "We don't make a scene yet," Elaine decided, her voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous purr. "We call Daniel here alone. We present this as a family tragedy, a mother trying to save a good young man from a lifetime of humiliation. It is truly sickening to watch a mother and sister sit in a dark room, manufacturing a lie just to strip away everything a person has worked for. If you find their behavior absolutely unacceptable, hit the like button right now to show that truth and dignity still matter. 2 hours later, the heavy iron knocker on the front door sounded twice. Daniel walked into the living room, his leather work satchel slung over his shoulder, his boots making a dull thud on the hardwood floor. He didn't take off his light jacket, remaining standing near the edge of the oriental rug while Elaine gestured toward the empty armchair with a soft, practiced sigh. "Daniel, dear, thank you for coming on such short notice," Elaine said, her voice instantly shifting into the warm, bok duong cadence she reserved for church fundraisers. "I asked you here without Naomi because what we have to discuss is incredibly painful, and as a mother, my heart is simply breaking for you." Melissa didn't say a word. She merely slid the stack of photographs across the polished mahogany table, ensuring the shot of me leaning close to Harold in the library sat right on top. Daniel looked down at the table, his eyes tracking across the images for several seconds without a single flicker of surprise or anger crossing his face. He didn't pull his satchel off his shoulder, and his breathing remained slow, even, and entirely controlled. Elaine leaned forward, patting her eye with a monogrammed linen handkerchief that was completely dry. "I know this must be a devastating shock, Daniel," she murmured, her voice trembling with artificial emotion. "We've known for some time that Naomi was receiving substantial yellow envelopes from this individual in public places. I couldn't let a wonderful, hard-working man like you walk down that aisle blindly, being completely camsung by a girl who prefers a secret arrangement to an honest marriage." Daniel reached down, his large, blunt fingers picking up the top photograph from the pile. He held it up to the dim amber light, his eyes focusing intently on Harold's face, tracing the sharp line of the old man's jaw and the silver hair reflecting the library lamp. Instead of slamming the photo down or demanding an explanation, Daniel's lips twitched into a very faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Do you mind if I keep this one, Mrs. Whitaker?" Daniel asked, his voice completely calm, stripped of any agitation or grief. The lighting in the library history aisle is actually quite clear in this shot. It captures his profile perfectly. Elaine froze, her hand pausing mid-air with the handkerchief as she stared up at him, her mind frantically trying to calculate his lack of a reaction. "Daniel, did you hear what I just told you?" she stammered, her bok duong composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "I am telling you your fiancé is living a double life." "I heard you perfectly," Daniel said, sliding the 8x10 print carefully into the side pocket of his leather satchel. "Thank you for your concern about my future. I'll make sure this gets the exact attention it deserves at the rehearsal dinner." He turned on his heel and walked out of the house, letting the heavy front door click shut behind him, leaving Elaine and Melissa sitting in the dark, entirely convinced that they had just broken his spirit, completely unaware that they had just handed him the final brick for their own execution. The low hum of the desktop computer fan was the only constant sound inside Daniel's architecture studio that evening. The office was a minimalist, converted brick warehouse space off Columbia Avenue, smelling of fresh plotters, graphite dust, and the stale black coffee sitting in a heavy ceramic mug on his desk. A single adjustable architect's lamp cast a sharp, conical beam of yellow light over a meticulous balsa wood model of a residential pavilion he was finishing. In the background, a vintage stereo receiver played a muted, slow-tempo jazz track, the bass notes vibrating faintly through the exposed iron floor beams. Daniel pulled his leather satchel onto the work table, unzipped the side pocket, and pulled out the glossy 8x10 photograph Melissa had given him. He laid it flat right next to the balsa wood house. under the warm light of the desk lamp. His mind went back to a rainy Thursday afternoon, exactly 4 months ago. Long before Melissa started hiring cheap private eyes, he had received a brief, formal phone call from a landline number that led him to the Cigar Club, an old, wood-paneled establishment tucked behind the historic courthouse square. The air in that club had been thick with the heavy, sweet scent of aged Dominican tobacco, cedarwood linings, and the faint tracking of rain boots on slate tile. Harold Bennett had been sitting in a high-backed leather wing chair, a small amber glass of neat bourbon resting on a small brass coaster beside him. The old lawyer hadn't smiled. He had simply reached into his breast pocket and laid a 40-page legal document flat on the small table between their chairs. It was a strict, ironclad prenuptial agreement drafted with cold, administrative precision. The terms were blunt. If Daniel married Naomi and the marriage dissolved for any reason, even if it lasted 30 years, Daniel would legally forfeit every single right to any asset, property, land, or residual income associated with the Whitaker name. Harold had leaned forward, his heavy silver eyebrows knitting together as his hand flattened over the legal pages. I've spent 40 years watching young men use sweet words to secure foundations they didn't dig themselves. Daniel, Harold had said, his voice a low, dry rasp that stayed beneath the crackle of the fireplace. If you want to walk down that aisle with Naomi, your signature goes on this line today, or the doors to her family's resources stay permanently locked to you. Daniel hadn't blinked, hadn't leaned back to call a personal attorney, and hadn't even lifted the amber glass to stall for time. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his heavy aluminum drafting pen, and flipped straight to the final signature page without reading a single subclause. It took him less than 5 seconds to press the blue ink into the parchment paper, his handwriting steady, clean, and completely devoid of hesitation. He slid the 40-page document back across the cedar table toward the old man. I'm an architect. Mr. Bennett. I build my own structures from the ground up, Daniel had said, his voice matching the quiet stillness of the room. I'm marrying Naomi because she knows the value of soil and stone, not because of whatever paper numbers her father left behind. That 5-second signature was the exact moment Harold's cold gaze shifted, a faint nod of professional respect passing between the two men. Harold had taken a slow sip of his bourbon, reached back into his leather briefcase, and turned to page 12 of a completely separate, sealed file. That was the afternoon Daniel learned every single detail about the Whitaker Family Trust, the $6.8 million in commercial holdings, manufacturing shares, and the lake house property. But Harold had raised his hand, his old gold signet ring catching the light, and extracted a solemn, professional oath of absolute confidentiality from Daniel. Naomi must never know about this meeting, and she must not know the scale of the trust until the exact day she turns 32, Harold had instructed. His eyes locked onto Daniel's. Her father wanted her to carry her own weight until the final hour, without the psychological burden or the paranoia of knowing how much her mother and sister would try to tear her apart for it. Now, back in his quiet studio, Daniel picked up the spy photograph of Harold and Naomi sitting on the park bench. He looked at the little balsa wood house on his desk, checking the alignment of the walls with a small steel ruler. His mother was worried about the wedding. His future mother-in-law thought she had broken him, and his fiancé's business assets were frozen. But as he carefully placed the photograph back into his drawer, his fingers were completely relaxed. The foundation had been poured 4 months ago in a smoke-filled room, and the structure was ready to withstand the storm Melissa was about to unleash. The morning sun outside the brick windows of the Frothy Monkey did nothing to warm the small wooden table where my coffee had gone entirely cold. It was exactly 7 days before the wedding, and the cafe was crowded with the usual downtown Franklin morning rush. the sharp hiss of the espresso machine, and the clinking of ceramic mugs filling the air. I sat with a white linen napkin balanced on my lap, my work phone vibrating against the cedar tabletop every few minutes with a predictable, monotonous hum. A text message from Melissa lit up the screen. "Enjoy these last few short days of bliss, little sister. The truth is finally coming out into the daylight." I didn't type a reply, nor did I delete the message. I simply watched the notification slide away, leaving my screen dark again. 2 hours later, I stood inside the bridal boutique off Main Street, the heavy scent of synthetic lavender and stiff tulle clinging to the air of the dressing room. My mother sat on the velvet sofa outside the three-way mirror, her fingers turning the pages of a local wedding vendor catalog with a slow, dry snap. When the consultant brought out the veil I had selected weeks ago, a simple, unadorned silk tulle, Elaine didn't even look up from her pages. "We've adjusted the final boutique invoice, Naomi," my mother said, her voice dropping into that quiet, critical tone she used whenever she wanted to minimize my presence. "Given the current audit uncertainties surrounding your landscaping capital, we had to scale back the ornamental spending. There's no need for excess when things are so unstable." Melissa stood near the accessories rack, casually dangling a cheap, discounted plastic hairpiece between her manicured fingers with a small, mocking smile. "Mother is right, Naomi. It's all about maintaining a realistic budget for your situation," my sister murmured, her eyes shifting to my reflection in the glass. "We wouldn't want you looking like you're trying to perform above your actual station, especially with everyone watching you so closely right now." They spent the next hour speaking over me, changing the floral arrangements with the boutique staff and moving me out of every single administrative decision as if I were a charity case waiting for a verdict. I stood perfectly still on the wooden pedestal, the pins of the dress scraping faintly against my skin, my jaw locked tight as I absorbed their small, daily cuts without a word. The real blow arrived later that afternoon, when I returned to my truck and opened my business email on my tablet, the battery icon flashing red in the corner. A notification from the Franklin Preservation Gala Committee showed that our company's foundational bid for their annual historical garden renovation had been pulled from the docket. I called the committee's lead director, Mrs. Gable, an elderly, deeply religious woman who held immense social and financial influence over every commercial contract in Williamson County. Her voice over the speaker was strained, cautious, and heavily coated with Southern judgment. "Naomi, your sister Melissa stopped by the parish office yesterday afternoon to drop off some historical records." "Mrs." Gable said, the sound of her turning papers coming through the line. "She mentioned some very specific concerns regarding the moral integrity of your company's external funding sources. And given our board's strict code, we cannot risk our public association until these rumors are cleared." Melissa hadn't just tried to break my engagement. She was systematically poisoning the well of my entire livelihood, using her cheap private eye photographs to destroy my commercial reputation before I could even stand at the altar. My knuckles turned white against the steering wheel of my truck, the hot air from the vents blowing against my face as a dark, cold wave of anger finally settled deep into my chest. I didn't drive over to my mother's house to scream, and I didn't send a frantic text to Daniel demanding he intervene. I put the truck in gear, pulled out of the gravel lot, and dialed Harold Bennett's direct office landline. The old lawyer answered on the second ring, the steady, rhythmic ticking of his office clock audible in the background. "They've officially stepped across the boundary line. Uncle Harold," I said, my voice completely level, stripped of the rage that was burning through my veins. "Melissa just took her little performance to Mrs. Gable to freeze my commercial bids. They think they have me backed into a corner." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by the dry, rustling sound of Harold opening a heavy metal filing cabinet drawer. "What do you want to do, Naomi?" the old man asked quietly. "Don't block the hit," I replied, staring straight through the dusty windshield at the historic courthouse square. Let them walk straight into the center of the room with everything they think they have. I want you to prepare the original trust documentation, the certified deeds, and my father's final sealed file for the rehearsal dinner. It will be loud, child, Harold warned. No, I said, letting my fingers loosen against the steering wheel as a hard, dry smile touched my lips. The truth doesn't need to be loud to leave them with absolutely nothing. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain had entirely stopped inside the barn at Sycamore Farms. The ambient jazz music that had been drifting through the hand-hewn oak rafters was gone, replaced by a low, mechanical hum from the portable projector Melissa had set up at the back of the room. On the large white pull-down screen behind the head family table, the glossy 8x10 photograph of me on the park bench near the historic square was projected in sharp, pixelated detail. The light from the lens hit the side of my ivory Luth dress, illuminating the tight, pale line of my jaw as I sat perfectly still. Melissa held the black wireless microphone close to her lips, her voice vibrating through the wall speakers with an artificial, trembling theatricality. "Naomi Whitaker is a fraud," she shouted, her free hand gesturing wildly toward the screen where my hand was captured wrapping around Harold's wrist. "She has been sleeping with this 74-year-old man for years just to fund her lifestyle, and she brought his dirty money into this family under the guise of an honest business." Beside her, our mother Elaine sank slightly into her wooden chair, pressing a dry white linen handkerchief to the corner of her eyes, her shoulders shaking with a calculated, synchronized show of maternal grief. I tried to stop her. "Mrs. Brooks," Elaine whimpered loudly enough for the entire front row of tables to hear. "As a mother, I am simply devastated that my youngest daughter has dragged our family name through the mud for a secret arrangement." A heavy, suffocating murmur broke out across the 40 wedding guests, the sound of chairs shifting and hushed whispers cutting through the warm, candlelit air of the hall. I didn't move a single muscle, my spine pressed flat against the back of my chair, my arms resting loose on the edge of the white tablecloth. The veins in my neck were pulsing hard against my skin, a cold, leaden anger settling deep into my chest. But my face remained an absolute sheet of ice. I didn't blink as I stared directly through the dim projector light, locking my eyes onto my sister's face, watching the small, twitching smirk of triumph she couldn't quite hide behind the microphone. Then, the heavy legs of a wooden chair scraped violently against the floorboards at the Brooks family table. Mrs. Brooks, Daniel's mother, stood up with her hands gripping the edge of the linen cloth so hard her silver rings clicked together. Her face was flushed red under her pearls, her eyes locked onto me with a mixture of rigid Southern judgment and deep social mortification. "Daniel, I will not sit through this for another second," she said, her voice cutting through the whispers like a razor blade. "I require a full, satisfactory explanation from your fiancé right now, or the church doors will remain locked tomorrow morning and this entire wedding is canceled." The room held its breath, 40 pairs of eyes shifting from the screen straight to the head table, waiting for the frantic tears or the breakdown they thought I was hiding behind my stillness. But before the silence could stretch, the chair beside me moved with a slow, deliberate fluidity. Daniel stood up. He didn't look at his mother, and he didn't offer a single glance toward Elaine's dry handkerchief. His face was completely unreadable, his breathing steady and slow as he reached into the breast pocket of his light-tailored suit jacket. His fingers emerged holding a small, faded piece of paper, a physical photograph whose edges had turned a dull, pale yellow over the years. He didn't check the images on the projector screen, and he didn't adjust his collar. With slow, heavy steps, his boots thudding against the oak planks, Daniel walked past the scattered wine glasses, bypassed our mother completely, and stepped directly onto the small wooden riser where Melissa stood with the microphone. He held the yellowed print under the bright spotlight of the stage. His fingers completely relaxed as he reached out and took the microphone right out of my sister's hand before she could even think to pull it away. The bright lens of the digital projector caught the edges of the faded photograph in Daniel's hand, casting a large, shaky rectangular shadow across the center wall of the hall. He didn't raise his voice, but the acoustic design of the barn at Sycamore Farms carried his words perfectly into the furthest corners of the silence. "Melissa," Daniel said, his voice dropping like an anchor into the room's suffocating stillness. "Your private investigator used a digital zoom, but 11 years ago, a standard 35mm camera captured a much clearer reality." He reached over to the input cable on the side of the media podium, unplugged Melissa's phone, and connected a small silver flash drive he had kept in his trouser pocket. The screen behind us flickered once, the pixelated surveillance photos of the park bench instantly replaced by a high-resolution scan of an old, glossy print. The image showed a wood-paneled office filled with heavy law books, the light from a window ruffling the edges of some loose files. 3 people stood in the center of the frame. On the left was my father, Richard, looking healthy, his shoulders broad and his gray work shirt untucked at the waist, just the way he always wore it before his heart began to fail. On the right stood Harold Bennett, his hair still dark charcoal, his hand resting firmly on the shoulder of a 21-year-old version of me, who was laughing with a bright, unburdened radiance I hadn't felt in a decade. The room let out a collective, uneven shift of breath, the sound of 40 people realizing the visual math of Melissa's scandal had just completely collapsed. Melissa's fingers twitched against her designer clutch, her face losing its triumphant flush as her eyes darted across the sharp lines of our father's face on the screen. Elaine sat perfectly frozen, her dry linen handkerchief remaining glued to her cheek, her mouth slightly open as she stared at her late husband's image. To watch a man stand up and completely dismantle a year of cruel gossip with a single piece of evidence is a moment of pure justice. If your heart is racing for Naomi right now, drop the word justice in the comments below. Daniel clicked the wireless remote in his palm, and the image on the screen flipped to a second scan, the reverse side of the exact same photograph. Across the yellowed, textured backing paper, a short paragraph was written in a heavy, slanted cursive using an old fountain pen with a distinct shade of dark teal ink. The words were magnified to 3 feet tall on the white linen screen. "Harold, if anything happens to me before my time, I need you to hold the foundations, keep the noise away from her, and protect my little girl until she is fully ready to stand on her own." Beneath the text, Richard's signature was clearly visible, stamped over by a small, blue notary seal with a registered date from 11 years ago, Mrs. Brooks leaned forward so fast her pearl necklace swung out, her eyes scanning the teal cursive 3 separate times before she let out a slow, deflated sigh. The whispers that had been cutting through the room like razor blades turned into an absolute, stunned vacuum of comprehension. Melissa tried to reach for the microphone wire, her voice cracking as she stepped toward the riser. "This doesn't prove anything about the current bank freeze or the yellow envelopes," she stammered, her eyes wild. Daniel didn't slide away from her. He simply turned the microphone volume knob on the podium up by 2 notches, ensuring his response drowned out her frantic pacing. "I knew exactly who Harold Bennett was the day I asked Naomi to marry me," Daniel said. His voice ringed with an ironclad certainty that caused his mother to finally lower her hands to her lap. 4 months ago, I sat in a cedar-lined room and signed away every legal right to the Whitaker assets because I wanted this woman, not her ledger. He looked directly at Elaine, whose gold bracelets were no longer clinking because her hands were shaking too hard to move. "The man you spent the last week calling a sugar daddy to every business owner in Franklin is the only person in this county who kept his promise to your husband," Daniel said, his thumb pressing down hard on the podium's wood edge. He didn't spend 9 years spending Richard's money on silk shirts. He spent 9 years watching Naomi pull trailers through the mud to make sure she was strong enough to survive the day you tried to strip her bare. I looked up at the ceiling beams, my chest heaving against the silk of my dress as the suffocating pressure of the last 7 days finally broke apart inside me. I didn't let a single tear drop, but my fingers uncurled from the edge of the tablecloth, completely free of the weight they had tried to hang around my neck. The heavy, double wooden doors at the back of the barn at Sycamore Farms creaked open with a slow, administrative weight. The low chatter that had started to rise after Daniel finished speaking died instantly as Harold Bennett stepped into the hall. He was wearing a charcoal wool 3-piece suit that had been hand-tailored off the row in Nashville, his posture entirely rigid, his black leather Oxfords clicking with absolute precision against the oak floorboards. Behind him, 2 young legal clerks in matching dark attire followed, each carrying a heavy, brass-latched brown leather briefcase that smelled faintly of old parchment and fresh ink. Harold didn't cast a single glance toward the Brooks family table, nor did he look at the projector screen where my father's scanned signature still glowed against the white linen cloth. He walked straight to the small wooden riser, his leather briefcase clicking as he set it flat on the media podium next to Daniel's aluminum drafting pen. He unlatched the brass fittings with 2 sharp metallic snaps that echoed through the silent rafters. My name is Harold Bennett, and for 42 years I served as the primary corporate counsel for Richard Whittaker's hardware and logistics firms. The old man said, his voice no longer a library whisper, but a clear, resonant baritone that filled every square inch of the room. 9 years ago, following the execution of Richard's basic personal will, a separate sealed legal entity went into effect under my direct supervision, the Whittaker Family Trust. Melissa's hand dropped from her designer clutch, her face turning a dull, chalky white as she watched Harold pull out a thick stack of blue-bound parchment paper bearing the silver seal of the state of Tennessee. This trust contains exactly $6.8 million in asset capitalization, Harold continued, his eyes tracking across the document with cold precision. It comprises the full deeds to 3 active manufacturing facilities in Rutherford County, the unencumbered titles to the Timms Ford Lake House properties, and the entire residual investment portfolio of the Whittaker estate. A collective, sharp intake of breath rattled the glasses at the middle tables. Elaine's fingers clutched the edge of her dry linen napkin so hard her gold rings began to cut into her skin, her mouth opening as if she wanted to object. But no sound came past her lips. Under the explicit directives left by Richard, the distribution of these assets was subject to a dual-gate timeline, Harold explained. Turning to page 14 of the blue parchment, the sole designated primary trustee, Naomi Whittaker, was required to reach her 32-year milestone, and she was required to enter into a valid, legally verified marriage contract with a partner who demonstrated zero financial reliance on the estate. He paused, letting his bifocals drop slightly as he looked directly at me. Today is July 8th. Naomi reached her 32nd birthday exactly 9 hours ago. And 4 months ago, Daniel Brooks executed an unconditioned prenuptial waiver that satisfied the final structural parameter of this fund. Melissa's chest was heaving, her fingers twitching as she took a frantic step toward the podium. This is ridiculous, she cried out, her voice cracking under the weight of the ceiling speakers. Mother is the executor of the estate. You've been hiding millions from us while Naomi lived like a blue-collar laborer. Harold didn't raise his hand to silence her. He simply flipped the blue-bound document to the very final page, where a thick red notary line was stamped with a heavy wax seal. Section 9, Clause 4, the Anti-Coercion Trigger Clause. Harold read, his voice dropping into a rhythmic, chilling administrative cadence. Richard Whittaker explicitly detailed that if any residual beneficiary of his estate should ever utilize legal harassment, forensic asset interference, or public character assassination to disrupt, delay, or force the liquidation of Naomi's designated transfer, their rights would be permanently nullified. The room went entirely sub-zero. Any attempt to sabotage this marriage or freeze Naomi's commercial capital automatically strips the offending parties of their annual stipends, their residential allowances, and their access to any family real estate, Harold said, his eyes finally dropping onto Elaine's frozen face. He reached into the second leather briefcase held by his clerk and pulled out a certified green folder. On Tuesday at 10 p.m., Elaine Whitaker filed a fraudulent motion for a forensic audit on Whitaker Landscape Design, Harold noted, sliding a stamped copy of the bank affidavit across the wood. On Wednesday afternoon, Melissa Whitaker submitted unauthorized surveillance photographs to the parish office of Mrs. Gable to terminate Naomi's commercial contract. He looked up, his old silver eyebrows rising with a terrible, quiet majesty. Every single one of these actions has been documented by my firm and entered into a formal ledger of non-compliance. As of 3:10 p.m. this afternoon, when the bank freeze was officially executed, the anti-coercion clause automatically triggered, Harold declared, slamming the heavy blue file shut with a dull, final thud. Elaine and Melissa Whitaker are legally removed from the Whitaker registry. Your monthly dividend checks are canceled. Your keys to the Timms Ford Lake House are revoked. Your remaining residual store stock is permanently dissolved and transferred to the Richard Whitaker Memorial Scholarship Fund for first-generation students. He turned to the two clerks behind him and pointed toward the double doors. The private security team I hired is waiting in the vestibule to escort you out of this establishment, Harold said, his voice flat, dry, and absolute. You no longer have a financial incentive to stay. The heavy click of the double wooden doors shutting at the back of the hall signaled the final exit of my mother and sister, their hurried, sharp heels fading down the gravel vestibule walkway. The barn at Sycamore Farms became instantly cavernous, the silence settling over the room like dust after a structural collapse. Only a dozen people remained, Daniel's immediate family, Mrs. Gable, who sat with her head lowered in a quiet, stunned posture, and Harold's two clerks who were quietly packing the blue parchment papers back into the leather cases. The air still smelled faintly of the beeswax candles and the prime rib dinner that nobody had finished. But the suffocating weight that had pressed against my chest for 7 days was completely gone. Harold stepped down from the wooden riser, his leather shoes making a slow, rhythmic thud against the oak planks as he approached our table. He didn't offer a celebratory smile, nor did he make a speech about the legal execution that had just unfolded in front of the 40 wedding guests. He simply reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single, unadorned yellow manila envelope, its corners slightly softened from being kept in a heavy metal safe for nearly a decade. This is the final piece of the foundation, Naomi, Harold said, his baritone voice dropping into a gentle, scraping whisper that felt entirely sacred. I've carried this packet through 9 years of audits, dinners, and library meetings, waiting for the exact hour your father specified. I reached out, my fingers trembling faintly as they touched the textured paper, the warmth of Harold's hand transferring to mine before he stepped back to give me space. Daniel moved his chair closer, his large, solid hand wrapping around my shoulder, providing a silent, immovable anchor as I slid my thumb beneath the paper seal of the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream bond paper, folded into 3 clean sections, covered entirely in the familiar, heavy cursive writing using that unmistakable dark teal ink. The moment my eyes locked onto the first line, the steel mask I had worn through the surveillance, the bank freeze, and Melissa's microphone presentation completely shattered, a single, hot tear rolled down my cheek, splashing onto the linen cloth before I could blink it away, followed by 9 years of suppressed grief leaking out in silent, heavy breaths. Naomi, my sweet girl, the cursive script read, The ink slightly faded at the margins. If you are holding this parchment in your hands, it means Harold has looked into your eyes and verified that you have become a woman, strong enough to stand in the center of the storm without needing anyone to rescue you. My chest heaved against the silk of my ivory dress as I forced myself to track the heavy lines down the page. Daniel's grip tightening against my shoulder. I did not construct this $6.8 million trust out of a desire to make you wealthy. Naomi, I built it because I spent 30 years watching your mother and sister turn our family name into a series of greedy calculations. They look at people the way a bank assessor looks at real estate square footage. And I knew that the moment my heart failed, they would try to strip you bare to feed their own vanity. This fund was my final wall, built to ensure that your independence could never be negotiated away by people who do not know the value of labor. I paused, wiping my nose with the back of my hand, thinking the emotional weight of my father's voice was the only thing the letter held. But as my eyes dropped to the final paragraph, the text shifted into a smaller, tighter script that caused my breath to stop completely in my throat. There is a truth you must hold now, Naomi. One that I could never tell you while I was breathing because it would have placed a target directly on your back. 6 months before my diagnosis, I uncovered the medical logs from our upstairs medicine cabinet. Your mother had been systematically altering my daily blood pressure prescriptions, mixing low-grade digitalis into my water to accelerate my cardiac decline and secure the primary estate title. The room seemed to tilt slightly, my ears humming with a cold, terrifying clarity as the ink on the page blurred. I discovered her calculation too late to save my own structure, but I had exactly enough time to move every single piece of my capital out of her reach and into Harold's custody. I chose to go quietly, letting her believe her performance had succeeded, because if I had filed a police report in Franklin, she would have turned her malice toward you to secure the remaining corporate stock. My silence bought you 9 years of safety to grow your roots deep into the dirt. I gave up my final days so that you could have an entire lifetime of freedom. I stared at the teal ink signature at the bottom of the page, my hand shaking so hard the cream paper rattled against the linen. The father I thought had simply succumbed to a weak heart had actually stood in the dark, absorbing a slow, quiet murder just to ensure that the net would never close around his little girl. The grandfather clock in Harold Bennett's office ticked with a slow, administrative peace. A week had passed since our quiet wedding at the stone church. Free of cameras and bitter family calculations, the afternoon Franklin sun threw warm blocks of light across the old Persian rug and the antique floor safe. Daniel stood beside me, his thumb tracing the silver band on my finger as Harold stepped forward. The old lawyer placed a heavy brass skeleton key into my palm without a word. I stepped up, inserted the metal into the vault's hidden drawer, and turned it until an oily click echoed. Inside, there was only a small notebook bound in black leather, its corners heavily frayed. I lifted it, smelling cedar shavings and my father's tobacco. On the first page, written in his signature teal ink, he had left one solitary sentence: "Being trusted is worth far more than being rich." I walked over to the window, looking out at the rolling hills of Williamson County. I leaned into Daniel's chest, his strong arms wrapping around my waist, a steady fortress that required no legal paperwork. The $6.8 million in manufacturing facilities and lake house deeds sat on the desk behind us. But my true victory was right here. My father's ultimate lesson wasn't about currency. It was about the absolute clarity of having a partner who would sign away a fortune in 5 seconds to protect my dignity. Suddenly, my phone vibrated with a long, rambling text from Melissa's unsaved number, filled with frantic apologies. She claimed her landlord in Murfreesboro was threatening eviction because she couldn't clear her rent. I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. I simply touched her profile and permanently blocked her number from my life. For 9 long years, my mother and sister lived in a dark room, convinced I was hiding a man in the shadows of Franklin. What their greedy calculations never allowed them to understand was that he wasn't a secret lover. He was just a loyal friend, keeping his final promise to a dying father. To every older American watching this right now, who has spent decades pouring your life into family only to be treated like a financial ledger, do not waste your remaining years begging to be loved by people who only value your inheritance. Your worth is not up for negotiation, and your peace is a fortress you have every legal right to defend. If those who share your blood only view you as a set of math equations, have the courage to build your own wall, change your locks, and leave them with absolutely nothing. There are so many more incredible stories of justice and quiet paybacks waiting for you right here on this channel. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now to see how another quiet woman dismantled a corrupt family scheme using nothing but public records. Stay tuned, because in our next episode, I am bringing you a shocking new story about an elderly widow in East Tennessee who discovered what her children did with her lake house title while she was recovering in the hospital. You won't want to miss the calculated trap she set for them at the family reunion. Thank you for standing with me today. This has been Valera Payback, and we will see you in the next one.